Saying that Claremont's X-Men employs BDSM symbolism is kind of like saying that Iron Man employs themes of the military-industrial complex. It's pretty well known. But where that military-industrial complex is an openly discussed, easily broached subject for academic inquiry, BDSM symbolism is not, for a variety of reasons pertaining to Western culture's infamous attitudes about discussing sexuality. This of course leaves our mutant heroes in a difficult position. BDSM is not a proper acronym, but a combination of multiple acronyms, which include bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, and sadism and masochism. Each represent an individual set of sexual and cultural practices, often operating exclusively, but certainly capable of intersecting and overlapping. Sometimes they're not even sexual, though often they are. BDSM practices also have a rich history of misunderstanding. Previously listed as a sexual disorder by the DSM, they are now considered nothing more than sexual practices. A thing people do for pleasure with no evidence of connection to any malady or prior trauma. Though still culturally frowned upon, or even snickered at, consensus of the modern medical community seems to be that BDSM is perfectly healthy, so long as informed consent and intelligent precautions play a role in all interactions. The first thing to note in laying a groundwork here is that these sexual practices have some intriguing intersections with established narrative practices of the superhero genre, which often feature bondage as a form of restraint, dominance and submission as elements of conflict, and antagonists defined through practices of sadism that often result in masochistic spectacles of heroic suffering. This overlap means that you're gonna get a lot of false positives when you go looking for BDSM symbols in a superhero comic. But it also gives creators plausible deniability with censors when they do directly and intentionally include those symbols in their work, thus empowering the practice in counterintuitive ways. Fortunately for us, Claremont's use of BDSM symbolism goes way beyond plausible deniability. The obvious evidence here begins with the Hellfire Club, Claremont's most famous BDSM symbol, though by no means his only one. Inspired by an episode of the Avengers TV series, not the superhero Avengers, Claremont and Byrne's Hellfire Club gathered together a number of forms of domination, class, gender, species, and heritage, and intersected them with highly sexualized attire and practices of bondage and sadism. The Hellfire Club also establishes a curious and paradoxical tonal issue in that Claremont quite consistently villain codes his sadist/dom characters. The characters who exhibit the BDSM symbols aren't usually the good guys. That villain coding gets even more complicated when we consider that BDSM practices often depend upon performative elements, so much so that BDSM interactions are literally referred to as scenes, while participants are even given a code word to break the scene in the form of safe words. This is to say that scenes in X-Men that symbolize BDSM practices might villain code the DOMs and hero code the subs, but perhaps not the practices themselves, which are all perfectly in keeping with the performative aspects of BDSM culture. From a narrative perspective, that's kind of fascinating. We normally think of villain coding as inherently negative, but it doesn't have to be. More recent conversations in the Academy speak to our ability to differentiate between the pleasure in looking and the pleasure in identifying with a character. Thus, it's possible to find Emma Frost's torture of Storm appealing, even erotic, yet still root for Jean to wipe her mind in a psychic duel. A duel that portrays Jean with aroused nipples, FYI, just in case anyone was still committed to denying the sexual symbolism. This coding practice continues throughout the run, with Rachel portrayed as a hero wearing bondage gear in her hound costume. Again, though, she associates the costume with evil, guilt, and shame. We find similar associations with Selene, with Wolverine/Weapon X, with various telepathic possessions, and on, in an endless cycle of BDSM symbol mixed with moral commentary, mixed with direct sexualization. The full meaning behind this recipe can only be speculated on, but suffice to say it's something the average Freudian might have a field day with. We need to note, however, that Claremont also draws forward discussions of consent, featuring them prominently in things like Xavier's ideals about the ethics of telepathy, ideals that, yes, he breaks a lot, but at least those conversations are happening and those values espoused. They also come forward in key scenes of BDSM symbolism such as Callisto's abduction of Angel, a riff on the Barbarella film, and Storm's reflection on the distinction between desire and love. There's also a lot of queer coding thrown into the mix. For example, the Hellfire Club scenes contain a lot of homoerotic imagery, as does Phoenix/Magma's day-out encounter with Selene, as does Wolverine's violent conflict with Sabretooth. The conflation of symbols just keeps getting more complicated, even as the pattern reveals itself. All of this leaves us with more questions than answers, but that's always a good start to an academic inquiry. Does the juxtaposition of sexualized characters and sadistic intent make them somehow both more threatening and appealing simultaneously? Does Claremont use scenes of accidental undress a lot to humiliate his characters? Is Rogue's symbolic representation of restraint in the form of avoiding all touch somehow a source of sexual tension? Do Wolverine's sadistic elements make him more sexually appealing in general? For that matter, does Nightcrawler's intersection of demonic imagery and swashbuckling flirt somehow draw on these tensions? In all these ways, we can see how the BDSM symbolism, regardless of your position on actual BDSM practices, informs the narrative tension, character dynamics, and queer sensibility of X-Men comics. Our culture still doesn't really want us to talk about BDSM, but if we want to understand the X-Men comics of Chris Claremont, we're gonna have to. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to learn more about our project, you can find us on the web at www.claremontrun.com or follow us on Twitter @ClaremontRun.